Welcome back, everyone, to the Kriya Yoga podcast. Today, we're having another conversation with Craig Bullock, Isha Das of the Assisi Institute, who we've had on the podcast many times. Welcome back, Craig. It's wonderful to see you.
Oh, it's wonderful to be with. Everything just froze for a second. Okay, it's wonderful to be with you and all of your people again. Always an enjoyable, stimulating, sometimes challenging conversation.
Yes, well, we'll not be too challenging, I don't think, today, because we're talking about your new book, From Merchant to Mystic.
Yes.
Yeah, so I've read this book twice now, and there's lots of inspiration here and many things I want to talk to you about. But before we get into it, would you mind just telling us a little bit about the book, what inspired it?
Yeah, it's a long story, but I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. I had a spiritual awakening when I was 16. Probably 6 months after that, I stumbled on the first biography of Francis I ever read and was just kind of enamored with him ever since. So I tell people this book, its first germination was back when I was 16 years old.
Right.
But I've been working on it in earnest probably for the last 8 years. And I'll say it this way. So Francis has been one of my icons on the spiritual journey, that I think he embodies a lot of the universal principles that we all go through in our spiritual evolution towards self-realization and God realization. So he's always been an icon, and I've just always had an innate level of affection for him. I went to a Franciscan college. One of my two mentors, one being Roy Eugene Davis on the Kriya side, but Father Richard Rohr, a radical Franciscan priest on that side, has kind of mentored me. So that Franciscan spirituality ethos has been alive in me. But I was, when I first started learning about Kriya Yoga and Yogananda, and mostly through the writings of Kriyananda, discovered that Yogananda had a real devotion and appreciation of Francis. So for me, finding Kriya Yoga and then realizing that I could integrate something of Francis into it was just a homecoming for me. So in terms of writing this book, I really wanted to tell his story, but not just as another pious retelling of his life. There's literally thousands of those. But again, what is the map to self-realization? What is the map to God realization? And I see Francis as a kind of universal saint, that his story has something, I think, for all of us, regardless of what our specific paths are.
Yeah, yeah. I know when we were together in July for the retreat at the Assisi Institute with Swami Nirvanananda, I could tell how important the book was to you as you got, one of the author copies to read through. And I understand why it's so important to you, having read it twice myself now. But I remember when we were together, you were talking about the idea of the chakras and how it relates a little bit to this book. Am I remembering that correctly?
Oh yeah, I gave a whole talk on that. Yes.
Yeah.
I had us look at the chakras through the lens of Francis's experiences.
Mm-hmm. Would you be able to maybe give some insights or elaborate on that for folks who weren't at that talk?
Yeah, no, that's good.
Yeah.
So I remember when I first started studying Kriya Yoga and learned of the chakras, my first thought was, I have a very strong Christian background. I have a graduate degree in theology from the University of Notre Dame. And I remember my first thought was, why aren't the chakras in the Christian tradition?
Mm.
And then I realized how important the number 7 is. There are 7 sacraments, for example.
All right.
7 days of creation. So I began to make a link that way. There are 7 I am statements of Jesus in the Gospel of John. So that opened me up to the connection. So, and I'll give you some examples. We'll say that Francis was born with a very lively second chakra. He was very creative. He was very fluid. He was very sexual the first half of his life. And then after he had his spiritual awakening, it's not like that chakra closed. But what I like to say is it became divinized. It became filled with a greater wisdom and grace. So what I like to say to people, for example, Francis was a partier the first half of his life. He still was a partier the second half of his life, but it was at a much higher vibration.
Yeah.
So that would be an example. I think maybe one of the stories we will get into today is when he met a leper. And this was early on in his conversion process. And if anybody's familiar with the Enneagram, Francis was probably a 7. And 7s like everything that is beautiful and they resist anything that was ugly.
Yeah.
And so even his biographer, Thomas of Solano, said Francis avoided anything that was, not pretty, not pleasant. And so he meets this leper, and the leper is gross looking. And Francis's first impulse was to turn away. And then I'm paraphrasing now. He hears a voice like, Francis, that's me. I tear up talking about it. And he turned to the leper and he kissed him and dressed his wounds. And I think that was a moment when his heart chakra opened to this universal love,
Right.
Spiritual love, that divine love that embraced everything and everyone without judgment. So those are
Right.
just a couple of examples. Maybe another example in terms of the third eye. There's a beautiful prayer he wrote that I mentioned at the end of the book, where he prayed for wisdom so that, and again, I'm paraphrasing now, so that he could see what God's will was, so that he could see the truth and what his mission was.
Mhm.
And to me, that ties into the third eye, our capacity to see at a whole new level.
Right. Right. Yeah. And the heart chakra, that's really interesting too. He was very much into beauty, but then
Yeah,
what he ended up seeing was, like you said, partying, but then partying on a higher level, like
yeah,
appreciating beauty on a higher level as well.
yeah, yeah. Because what he said was he never saw ugliness and beauty the same after that. Everything took on a hue of beauty for him.
Right. Yeah, we could go a couple different directions with that. On one hand, we did talk about Yogananda and his thoughts and relationship with Saint Francis. We could talk about the tie into Kriya, but as I was reading the book, one of the things that stuck out to me, and then we'll get to the Kriya. Uh, one of the things that stuck out to me was that story you just told, and it just hit me in a way, and it made me. The first question I wanted to ask you as I was reading the book was I wanted to know, well, what were your lepers, Craig? And I know that might be a little personal, but I was just
No,
curious.
it's fine. Well, I'm going to answer on a really personal and deep level because one of the lessons I took away from that story was not only did we have to recognize the divine in all of the external lepers,
Mhm.
but we all have lepers in ourselves, pieces of ourselves that we judge without mercy, that we
Right.
don't want to see, that we judge as being lepers,
Mhm.
something to be avoided. So for me, ultimately, it is, I mean, there is an external reference, but it all starts from the inside that making peace with what I perceive to be my shadows, my shadow selves, the lepers that I have not wanted to look at. You can notice where my hand is as I'm talking about this right now. It's on my heart. To open my heart to those parts of me that I don't want to see, but to learn to see them with a measure of objectivity, but compassion.
Right. Yeah.
And what I'll just say is that I've been on this path for a long time, almost 40 years. I'll be 70 this December, and I'm still amazed at levels of the shadow and the leper inside of me that I
Mhm.
still have to look at. That
Right.
thought was done.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we could say this is the paradox. Once we open our heart, this has always been my experience to what we deem as unacceptable, then that the bliss of the soul just shines through.
Right.
It's all of these kind of deep impressions, samscaras, if you want to call them, that we don't want to look at, that put a shadow over the soul and keep us from seeing and experiencing the light that is always there.
Mhm. Yeah. For me, that was actually one of the most important points of the book. And, as I was contemplating asking you that question, what are your lepers? The funny thing was, is it's been maybe 3 or 4 months since we planned this podcast. And the weird thing is there was a point in time when I was meditating, and all of a sudden I became deeply and profoundly aware, and I can't put it into words, but I became deeply and profoundly aware of my own lepers. And I thought, wow, this whole time I just want to know what Craig's were. but
Yeah.
but the experience is as you describe it. It's, I think, learning to just, you said it. I can't say it any better than that. So
Yeah.
it's good.
Yeah.
And
I was just sharing with Vicky today, just recently, this whole layer of how personal do I want to get, just uncovering this level of self-disdain that I didn't even know was there.
right, right.
And it's not easy to look at it. That's, I think, what Francis's first moment of looking at this leper and then wanting to turn away, it's like, whoa, I didn't know that this layer of self-disdain was there the whole time.
Yeah, yeah. And from your perspective, then once you have an awareness of that, he St. Francis had an awareness. Well, he had an awareness, and then he realized something told him, a voice came to him, God, clearly.
Yeah.
But what about for the rest of us, where we might have an understanding, but God doesn't come right in and like give us the exact,
Oh,
yeah, what do you
that's
do
a good
there?
question. I will say there are at least two levels to that. One level, and I after I say this, I will qualify it, that to have a meditation practice, contemplative practice, not as an escape from whatever we need to look at, but as a larger context. I think what's enabling me to look at this layer of, self-disdain is I have an intuition of that. I
Yeah,
have an intuition, if I could anthropomorphize God, of God's love. It doesn't take away the discomfort, but it creates a bigger context
right.
to be able to see it. So I think one level is being having that intuitive sense of a larger consciousness can make room for the painful level of consciousness and to look at it objectively and compassionately. I think the next level is having people um, in our lives that love us unconditionally. The first thing I said to Vicky this morning uh, over our coffee was how much I appreciated her. And she said, why? I said, because you love me so unconditionally. It allows me, it frees me up to look at this stuff because she sees it in me, and she still loves me.
Right.
So having it can be one person, it can be a counselor, it can be a spiritual mentor, it can be a community of people that, not that they're never going to challenge you, but that their love is unconditional. Because I think when we've experienced trauma in our life, part of what keeps us from dealing with it early on is we didn't have that loving, supportive environment that would hold the space with us to look at it.
Right. Yeah, that reminds me of something. Many years ago, many people on the podcast know. I know Craig, that my wife Melissa passed away, and that was a very challenging experience. And recently, a friend of mine, she's about the same age as when Melissa passed. Her husband passed away, and I've been trying to find ways to speak to her and talk to her. And I think one of the difficulties is for her is that I don't know if she had that sense or that community or that context of life, having kind of been engaged in Kriya Yoga and spirituality for so long. And so not having that, it makes it harder to relate, and being present is fine. But in my experience, I had a backdrop of some other kind of understanding that was very helpful. And I think it's similar to kind of what you're saying here, that as we go through our process and we recognize what our lepers are, or how we need to look at our shadow or grow, it in a way, it sounds like if you're just kind of doing it on your own, like on a desert island in a dry, spiritually dry environment, it could lead you, it could be more difficult.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have, as you're describing, this support and this context, I think context is the right term,
Yes.
that makes it more possible.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think that that is absolutely true. And I'm going to bring up something you said to me, if you don't mind.
I don't know, it depends on what
I
it is.
I think this captures what you're saying. You told me the story of when Melissa was very sick,
Yeah,
that Roy came to be with you,
right,
and he didn't have any magic, to take away the pain. But I
right.
think just being with you on a human level, just being with you had to
Yeah,
make a difference, but also being with you with his consciousness, which is the larger context that you're talking about, made a
right.
difference.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's something that I when I talk to people, in the way, trying to encourage them to think about things or reflect on things in the way your book does, and in the way you've just discussed, um, encouraging that context, encouraging that, seeing it from like that spiritual perspective, how helpful that is. Because otherwise, when you're looking at your shadows, it's all you see is the shadows. You don't see light around them. Right.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
And this brings up the idea, we were talking about this a little bit before we got started, the idea of samskaras and the trauma and how it prevents us from seeing reality.
yes,
um, just tell me a little bit more about that. I know we almost got started into it, but
yeah, yeah. And I'm going to kind of go through this slowly because it's a kind of new insight,
yeah.
clarifying insight that I have, that when we experience trauma and we don't have that loving community and maybe the spiritual context to process it, I think that trauma then hardens into a samskara. It hardens into a distorted emotional way of viewing self and others, the world, and God.
Yeah.
And so, see if I can just give a simple example. Um, so, people come to the Assisi Institute, and because we have a very strong devotional element, I talk about God. And some people may, I've had people come to me, they were sexually abused by a priest, or they had an abusive nun, or their parents were not very loving. And intuitively, you kind of connect um, your sense of God with who your parents were. And
Mm,
so, what I see with them, and it's understandable that their sense of God is shaped by this emotionally old, unresolved trauma that has morphed into this samskara, which is not just a behavioral tendency, then that this samskara tendency then tends to create how we
mm.
see everything. And that's when we project ourselves onto other people. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah,
that to resolve the samskara, I don't think you can just meditate it away. I think meditating is part of the resolution, but you have to really look at that samskara. And and the emotions tied in with it.
right.
And then in the context of the loving community and some level of spiritual realization, then you can begin to let go of the samskara. And
Yeah.
then you begin to see things as they really are. But until that, the samskara is determining how we see things. And
Mm.
it's always prejudiced.
Yes, and it's a hard thing to shake, though, isn't it? I mean, I think
Oh,
that's
oh,
the, yeah.
yes.
Well, and the difficulty is, uh, just to go with that. The difficulty is, and the difficulty is that if it's so fixed, you probably can't see it either.
No, yes.
Right. And I was just having a discussion about this during our last Sunday service. I was talking about mentors and I was talking about teachers. And I was saying, I've been fortunate that in my life, I've always had who I consider to be wiser elders.
Yes.
And I'd always had wiser elders. There's always been at least two in my life that I absolutely implicitly trusted. Like I
Yeah.
saw their behavior. I saw how what they taught and what they shared actually worked, for lack of a better word. And so if I had a doubt about something, I could bring it to them, or they could point something out to me.
Yes.
And because of my relationship with them, I wouldn't argue.
Yeah.
I might not like it and I might not necessarily agree, but I
Yeah.
would stop and I would take a while to see, is there truth in this?
Yeah.
And I think it's very hard for people for many reasons, because maybe they don't have access to that, or whatever, however it might be. But like that is a very, I think that is why, the guru lineage in theory is, in theory and in practice, is actually
Yeah.
such an important thing.
Yeah. I remember this was in the early days of the Assisi Institute before we were in our present building. Richard Rohr came to Rochester and he spoke one Thursday night at the Assisi Institute, and he stayed with me it was before I was married to Vicky, and he stayed with me in my apartment. And he gave me a real compliment. You're really doing well, etc. And then he said, "Do I still have permission to correct you?"
Right.
I swallowed and I said, "Yes." And he has
Yeah.
occasionally corrected me. And Roy, too, would occasionally correct me.
Yeah.
And it wasn't always, like you said, comfortable in the moment. But I think Richard Rohr said this to me once. He said, "Can you just stay objective with what I'm saying to you? Like, don't repress your feelings, but just stay as objective with what I'm saying to you as you possibly can."
Yeah. Yeah.
And that level of objectivity then allows you to look at what's going on with real discernment.
Right. Right. Yes. That's it's such a nuanced thing as well, how to navigate that, and
Yes.
how to decide for yourself, well, how do I look at this in a way that I can understand and rise above and resolve, and integrate it. I think integration is the main thing, not to say that I've got these traumas, I've got these samskaras, I've seen the world in this way and therefore I've been bad this whole time, but
Yeah.
to recognize that there's been a reason that you've had that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, how do I say that? A Franciscan priest said this to me once a long time. It wasn't Richard Rohr. It was a friend of mine. His name is Father Scott, but it's not important. I asked him once, how can God be so merciful with us? And he said, because God knows your history. And then he did a little clever thing. He knows his story. He knows your story. He
Right.
understands why you do the stupid things you do, that it's rooted in fear, pain, and unresolved trauma.
Yeah.
And so I think when we're coming from that larger place, yeah, we can acknowledge that we've done some destructive things,
Mhm.
but we acknowledge it's like, oh, I really didn't know better.
Right.
And given everything that I was dealing with at the time, I was doing the best I could at that moment.
Yes. Yeah.
And let me connect this to an insight from um, Krishna and the Bhagavad Gita. I think that's the part of the meaning when they talk about going beyond the concepts of good and bad,
Mm.
that you're able to just see things as they are without the moral judgment. It doesn't mean you throw morality out. You throw, dharma out. Doesn't mean that, but you're able to just really see beyond good and bad, which then allows you to really be able to see what's going on. Does that
Right.
make sense?
Oh yeah. 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 And I'm kind of curious, just to tie it a little bit more back into the book there. I'm wondering, working with these samskaras, uh, how do you feel, or maybe it's irrelevant, but how do you, or do you feel that the idea of the vows, the vows that Saint Francis, worked with, how do you feel that those help with like this idea of becoming aware of, or working through some scars? Is that a
Uh,
valid
that's
question?
that's a fantastic question. Okay. Um, Let me talk about vows in general, and then I'll put it specifically in the context of samskaras. We all live our lives in a very generic way by some kind of belief, ideology, uh, desire that shapes our life. We all do. What a vow is, it's making that desire, that aspiration explicit, and particularly a sacred vow. It's a vow you make in the context of God consciousness and and the context of other people on the spiritual pilgrimage with you. So Francis, it was literal poverty, chastity, or celibacy, and obedience. But those vows then, they become the container and the context for your life that doesn't ultimately restrict you. What it does is it gives you, I think, the safety and the space then to be able to deal with what's there. So when I took Kriya initiation, I took the commitment to meditate on a daily basis. And I'm not saying I never missed a meditation, but I haven't missed many, to be honest with you.
Right.
I took that as a vow. And that vow has become a container in the sense of, okay, when I meditate, I go to a place of stillness and silence. So my mind isn't running all over the place. My desires aren't ruling my life.
Right.
It creates this container then, plus it expands my consciousness. That is another level of a container that allows me to look at these samskaras. And if without that container of meditating, because particularly early on, but still occasionally, even the meditative experience is painful because the samskaras of the unresolved trauma bubbles up. So the vows, again, they're like a container that allow us to pursue what we need to pursue. It's sort of like an athlete, the discipline of their athletic practice, their diet, and all of that becomes a container that allows them to maximize their athletic potential. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess another way, tell me if this kind of fits in with that, it would be, for example, in relationships, if you have a vow to be monogamous with someone, well,
Yes.
then that opens up the relationship for more safety
Yes.
and trust, and therefore it's able to go deeper into the experience.
No, absolutely. That's a great example. That vow of fidelity
Yeah,
creates a boundary that really allows the relationship to flourish. And
yeah.
without that, I think it ultimately becomes compromised.
Yeah. And with these, with these vows, just I know people will get them when they read the book, but can you tell us just a little bit about each of the most important vows that Saint Francis held?
Yeah. Let's just start with the vow of poverty. Again, you have to understand this in the context of his life, and I think his vow was a prophetic sign that the division between the rich and the poor was growing. Not only did you have the noble class in the 12th century, but you had a burgeoning mercantile, merchant class emerging. And so his father was not from a noble family, but he was a very wealthy merchant.
Mhm.
And then the poor really were, one step above slaves because often they were just indentured servants to the people who had money. So the division was great. Secondly, I think Francis, the first half of his life, was so enamored with what his father's money could buy him.
Mm.
It was a samskara.
Yeah.
And so I think he took this radical vow of poverty. I mean, really, he took a vow he wouldn't even touch money. Now, I will translate that for us, but
Yeah.
um, partly to fight his samskara, maybe partly to rebel against his father a little bit. That could have been a part of it. But I think also to be this prophetic sign, that the gospel, so to speak, the message of Christ should be that everybody is valued, everybody has dignity, not just the wealthy. How I translate that for us is it's sort of non-attachment that and I've integrated kind of a yogic perspective to money that I see money as a power. It's the ability to influence life
Yeah.
for good or for bad. So for me, the vow of poverty is turning that influence, that money, placing it at the feet of the divine and using it for holy, divine, loving purposes. So that's
Mhm.
what I tell people is that you don't have to take a literal vow of poverty, but it is knowing that everything you have comes from the divine, belongs to the divine, and should be used for the divine in some way, shape, or form.
Right.
And it's
Okay.
also simplifying your life as much as you can and not complicating it.
Mhm.
The vow of celibacy is similar to the brahmacharya. It is, again, for most people, it's not a literal vow of celibacy, but it is using that sexual energy in a wise, loving, selfless, creative way. It's not repressing the sexuality, but bringing it up, and again, divinizing it and using it in a loving and creative way. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, yeah. Hmm.
And in terms of obedience, I'll tell a little story with Francis that early on, the young noble families were beginning to follow him of Assisi. And they went to the bishop, because the bishop was as much a civil authority in those days as a religious one. And they said, all of our young people are following him, giving up their money and turning away from their nobility. So even though the bishop was sympathetic to Francis, he was swayed probably by their money. And so he clamped down and forbid anybody from following Francis. So Francis said to the followers he had, we must go to Rome and they to talk to the Pope. And they said, are you going to state your case to the Pope why you're right and the bishop is wrong? And it's really beautiful. Again, I tear up almost whenever I talk about this. He said, no, I'm going to ask if I'm wrong.
Ah, yes, right.
So the obedience is just kind of touching on what we were saying before. It's the realization that the potential for any of us of self-delusion is great.
Mhm.
And to have, even if it's one other person that you have some level of accountability to, that you have given permission to correct you, um, is, I think, really important.
Yeah.
Because as we begin to really grow spiritually and mature, I think the temptation of self-inflation, the inflated ego, becomes
Yeah.
really great because you begin to have these incredible experiences. And then you haven't been completely purified and you think you're there, and then you become blind. We all know teachers who have done not great things because they had some awakening, but the samskaras weren't purified. So having some level of accountability to someone, some things other than yourself, I just think is really important. And that's how I translate the vow of obedience for most of us.
Yeah, yeah. And for those of us that aren't going to be going to the Pope and and asking things like that, uh, how would you recommend integrating those general ideas for normal folks who don't have a trip to the Pope in the future?
Yes. Well, I mean, one piece is just the humility, and by humility, I don't mean self-hatred. I don't mean anything like that. From the original Latin, the word humility comes from the word humus, which just means earthy.
Yeah,
It's the willingness to just be grounded and to realize that none of us see the whole picture
right.
and that we have the potential for self-delusion. So just that kind of, again, it's not self-hatred. It's just none of us are infallible, except my wife, my little.
Yes,
Uh,
of course.
but
Yes.
none of us are infallible. So that creates the openness. And depending on where you are in your journey, if you're heavy and dealing with the pain and the trauma, then I think having a really good, effective, wise therapist
Mm,
who can point things out to you that you don't want to see
right.
um, is really, really important. I think having what we talked about before, a spiritual mentor, spiritual director, and not that, you take a slavish vow of obedience. I don't mean that, but you're open to their feedback. Um, and I think having just good friends around you
Yeah.
who are honest and generally moving in the same direction that you are
Yeah.
is helpful. And I know I kind of touched on my relationship with Vicky earlier, but as sweet and as loving as Vicky is, she tells the truth.
Mhm.
And she'll tell me when she thinks I'm, you know, going in astray.
Yeah.
And I listen to her.
Yes. Yeah. I don't mean to take this in a little bit. It's on the same wavelength, but it might be not quite tied into the book exactly. Just all this discussion makes me reflect upon the idea of a spiritual lineage. And I personally make a big deal about that. And sometimes I wonder personally if I make a big deal about that because I actually had the luxury and the good fortune to have that kind of connection. And even after, Mr. Davis passed away, I was fortunate that I met a brother disciple who also was very wise. And so for me, I find that to be very important. And I wonder, how can we acknowledge that? And do you find that when people feel that they don't need that, uh, is that a problem in itself when someone says, "Well, I don't need this,"
I,
or yeah, go ahead.
well, I just think that's absolutely a problem.
Okay, okay,
Um, because until one reaches the pinnacle of evolution,
mhm,
um, the the ability again for ignorance to kick in, the ability for willful self-deception to kick in is strong. And I'm going to go back to the story of Babaji and the autobiography of a yogi, and it's a harsh story, but it's the one. I think he was an American who climbed the Himalayas, found Babaji, and said, "I want to be your disciple." And Babaji said, "You're not ready." Now, the guy had to have very good karma and had to be
yes,
spiritually evolved to get to find him in the first place. Okay.
absolutely, yeah,
And Babaji said no. And he said, "Well, if you're not going to accept me, I'm going to jump off the mountain and kill myself." Babaji said, "Jump off." And he did. And
yeah,
then Babaji resurrected him. But the point was the guy had really good spiritual realization to follow to find Babaji, yet there was still something that made him not quite ready.
right,
And Babaji said it was his willingness to do that made that purification that made him ready.
yeah,
So, and I mean this metaphorically for the most part, until we meet Babaji and he gives us the okay, whatever that means.
right.
Okay, metaphorically speaking, we need somebody. The potential for self-aggrandizement, etc., is just too great.
Yeah, and just to go back to that in your book, I've got the pages marked here. Let me find it. Uh, Around the chapter on uh, vows, you mentioned that there's two headings: narcissism and nihilism fill our contemporary culture, and then the next one is vows are an antidote to this narcissistic nihilism.
Yes.
Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. That Although I think maybe this is starting to shift, and I think there are more and more people awakening. I think, at least I hope, um, in spite of the craziness in the world. That Let me just start here. I've retired from my psychotherapy practice, and my wife's retired too. But we would talk about this as young people, like in their 20s and 30s, would come to see us, and they didn't really have pronounced mental health issues.
Mm,
They grew up in a context where their parents said, "We're not going to raise you any religion. You'll figure it out when you're 18." And so my point is, they had no reference point.
right.
Uh, Everything was wide open. They didn't have an intuitive sense that life had meaning and what is that meaningfulness.
Mm,
So, and I think that's true of the culture at large, is what I'm saying. And so, what that creates, first of all, is a void. Okay, then it's up to me to figure out what truth is, what meaning is. And if we're doing it in a void, then what we're ultimately saying is that, and particularly in a mere materialistic construct where there is no God, there's no higher life, no higher consciousness, it's up to me to figure it out. And I think it creates a kind of nihilistic void where there's nothing, and then I'm in charge. It was interesting, Nietzsche, the German philosopher, 19th, early 19th century, he was the one that made famous the line, "God is dead." And he didn't believe in God in the first place, so it wasn't a metaphysical statement. What he was saying, the idea of God and religion is dead. And then he had an interesting comment. he didn't say that was great. He said, there won't be enough water to clean the blood in the streets. That his insight once is that we make the egoic self the center, then anything's okay. Everything
Right.
is possible. There's no ultimate meaning. That's the nihilism.
Yeah.
And then I create the meaning. That's the narcissism. So the vows then, again, they place us in a context where we acknowledge a higher power, a higher consciousness. And I'll go back to what you were saying is, you know, part of what the Kriya lineage has done for me, and I'm going to paraphrase one of the 10 commandments, honor your mother and father. Now, at one level, that means honor your mother and father. But I think at a deeper level, it means honor the wisdom that they have passed on to you.
Mm.
And so I see the Kriya gurus, and for me, Jesus is certainly included in that, as my mother and fathers.
Right.
What have they passed on to me? I don't have to invent the wheel from scratch.
Right.
That's part of my whole purpose of the book, is that Francis's journey is a universal journey.
Mm-hmm.
It cuts across religions and time and culture. And so what are the essentials of that journey? Because if they were true then, they were true now. So that's where those vows come into play. I'm living in a bigger context. The poverty of letting go of some of my own assumptions. The celibacy, chastity is, okay, how do I redirect this energy of mine in a way that serves the truth? And am I willing to listen to something bigger than myself?
Right. That leads me to another question that was actually asked of me at the last Q&A that we did. And it was a question related to, how do you determine the difference between like healthy devotion to a teacher and that boundary there? And I was trying to figure out a way to describe that. And, I have and had great devotion to Mr. Davis and to another teacher. It's been extremely helpful for me. And that's because of what that relationship, that wisdom, as you mentioned, revealed to me. Like it was, I would never, that is probably the most important thing that I've ever experienced in my life. Like this which has been shared from their knowledge, from their life and their wisdom. And so that devotion is a love of that. And I guess what I'm wondering here is, for example, when people haven't experienced that yet, how do they recognize and cultivate that sense of that devotion? I don't know if I'm saying this.
No. It's a great question. You're saying it fine. Let me put it in the context of Roy Eugene Davis, Mr.
Yeah.
Davis. So before I met Roy, I read the autobiography of a yogi. I actually learned the technique in a way that I probably shouldn't have learned it. So I was already practicing, but I knew, and maybe this is part of my Catholic background, I intuitively knew that I had to be formally part of a lineage. Okay. So then I discovered Roy, and first of all, I realized Roy was a direct disciple. Roy wasn't self-appointed. He was ordained by Yogananda to teach.
Right.
So okay, all right. He represents a lineage that I respect. He was ordained by somebody that I reverence, Yogananda. All right, so we're moving in the right direction.
I
Okay.
see. Yeah. Yeah.
And then as I got to know Roy, and I can really say this, Roy did not want a personality cult.
Mhm.
And if you relied on him in a childish way, he would kind of like, like wouldn't answer your emails and things,
Yeah.
or he would
Absolutely.
just say, go, leave me alone in
Yeah.
a good way.
Yeah.
So I grew to trust him as a human being.
Mm.
And I saw it even, I was down at CSA a year ago, this past July. And one of the deepening appreciations I had was what Roy created
Mm.
and the unselfishness with which he lived his life.
Right.
That he gave his life to this and created something for other people that would last far beyond him.
Right.
So I saw all of these qualities in him. And so that's where the trust developed
Yeah.
over time.
Yeah.
So yeah, if a teacher wants you to follow him or her in a slavish way, that's a sign. If they need things from you, you know, like Richard Rohr never really wanted anything from me.
Yeah.
And even though I've gone off in a little bit of a different direction, I mean, I've incorporated everything he taught, but I'm a Kriya yogi. He's never said, "Why did you do that?" It's like, "I trust that you're going in the direction you need to go in. I know you're doing good things. That's enough for me." It's like, wow. And
Yeah.
Roy, the same thing. He gave me a lot of latitude of integrating mystical Christianity. So my two primary mentors and guides, I
Yeah.
trusted their character over it, but it took time.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's I I can concur with all of that experience. And
Yeah,
in your book, towards the end, you do talk about the trusted mentors, which I think we've spoken a good deal about. And but the
yeah,
next part of it, you talk about the willingness to partner with God.
yes.
So once we have this trusted mentor possibility in our life, what about this willingness to partner with God? Can you say more about that?
Yeah. I think in the book I quoted a Christian mystic, Valentine Tomberg,
Hmm.
and I'm going to paraphrase what he said, but first time I read it, it had a big impact on me, and I still think about it like all. It's one of those concepts that's always there.
Hmm.
He says God doesn't act in creation by some kind of, particularly within the sphere of the human arena, personally and collectively. That God doesn't act within the sphere of humanity and human consciousness by fiat. That whatever, again, we could have a whole conversation. What do we mean by God? But we'll keep it simple right now. That God can only interact with, again, this field of human consciousness to the degree that we avail ourselves to God. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
So, and everything we've talked about leads up to today, leads up to this. The more we go through purification, the more that we pray and meditate, the more that our will is purified, then we become conduits for the divine will. It's never one or the other. It's always a marriage of both. That in a sense, we become the divine in time and space. God is birthed in human creation in the human arena, in us and through us. There's a concept in yoga that I like, avatars, divine incarnations. But one way of understanding it is that they come into the world so just as a PO box for divinity. They come into the world just whatever we mean by God and all the energies and wisdom that flows from God. They are just a simple, pure conduit for it. So we can't expect God to do it, and we don't do it on our own from an egoic perspective. It's always this marriage of the divine and the human.
Right. Right. There was a book I was reading by a yogi who was describing in a way that idea of avatar, and he was saying that the avatars that come from that realm of light, he says that they're really indistinguishable from those that move up to the realm of light. Those
Yeah.
that purify themselves, and
Yeah.
like they're pure at that level. They're pure either way.
Yes.
And so I think that might speak to the idea of the saints, that
Yes.
that is what their lives are doing, is they're moving in that direction, and then
Yeah.
that's why they become saints.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So in your experience, in the everyday, because not everyone is meant to restructure the church or rebuild the church and so on. uh, how would you recommend a person to begin contemplating, or even just begin that process of, as you described, like partnering with God?
Well, it always begins, I always go back to this, with some sort of meditation practice.
Uh-huh.
And I always tell people, you may have wonderful experiences along the way, all kinds of, shows might show up, but what's most important is not that. It is, I'll say it two ways. It is nurturing the inner stillness and nurturing a higher consciousness, wisdom, and truth.
Become receptive to that.
Yes, become receptive to that. So that always begins with that. Secondly, everything that we're talking about, I think, is having some sense of being part of a lineage. But then I think it's the simple decision every day to make a decision to love your life. And I don't mean being in love with your personality or your self-image, but love the gift of your life. See your life as a wonderful opportunity and make a commitment every day to be as expansive, as truthful, as loving as you can be in your life. One of the things that I did, that I still do at some level, is I would ask myself this question. Now it's just become a part of my framework. How can I be the best husband I can be today? What does Vicky need from me today? And in terms of loving myself, I don't always like that concept. That's why I go to loving your life. How can I love my life? Well, that means respecting my body, my health, my legitimate needs. And that's a conscious decision, but it's a conscious decision every day to be the best version of yourself in every and all situations. Does that answer the question?
No,
And the little thing I like to share with people, it's a little practice I do when I'm in a situation where I can feel my samscaras rising up in my reactivity. Most of the time, because of meditation, I can get a handle on that. But then what I do is I ask myself in that moment internally, nobody around knows I'm asking this question, is what is the most loving and wise thing I can do in this moment? And invariably something you just know what you need to do. And 9 out of 10 times it's keep my mouth shut. Just listen and love this person, even though what they're saying is infuriating you at this moment.
Now I have a key insight into you there.
Yes, because they know they're doing the best they can at any given moment. And who am I to judge them ultimately? So, that ability to watch, to witness with compassion, and then just have the intention. What is the most loving and wise thing I can do in this moment? And after a while, it becomes second nature.
Yeah, good. Well, that might bring us to our time today. Is there anything else you'd like to say about? I mean, that was wonderful. I'd like to conclude with that thought, but I also want to know if there's anything more you'd like to say about your book.
Well, one more thing. There's a chapter I have on Claire of Assisi, who was Francis's sidekick, and they really are one pillar holding up the Franciscan spirituality that is very much alive to this day. And maybe it's good to close with this. She said that we become what we love. If we love nothing, we become nothing. If we love meanness, we become mean. And if we love the divine, our life becomes a divine affair.
I think that's perfect to end
I think that's perfect too, yes.
Yes. Well, thank you for being here again.
All right, can I just tell people the book is available, Merchant to Mystic on Amazon?
Yeah, and we'll put a link to that in the podcast and also in the YouTube video.
Good, thank you.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
All right.